For coming to hear my talk today. I have to start just by taking a little survey of all of you. So what I want to know is if you think that zombies are fact or fiction. So we're going to do a little show of hands. If you think that zombies are fiction, raise your hand up in the air. High. All right, if you think zombies are fact, raise your hand up in the air high. We've got a few more on the fact side. So what I'm going to talk about today is the evolutionary biology of zombification. And now, of course, depending on how you define a zombie, you might be more likely to say a zombie is something real or a zombie is something fictional. But what I'm going to do today is talk to you about zombification more generally, more broadly, in terms of evolutionary biology and psychology. And I hope that I will show you that zombies are indeed real. So that is one of my goals for today. So just to give you a little overview of where we're going with the talk today, I'm going to start with the evolutionary biology side. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the foundations of these ideas about zombification, how they're rooted in sort of the literature on taking a selfish gene kind of perspective towards understanding the evolution of organisms, and about the microbiome and how that kind of fits in with these larger theoretical issues with the zombification. And I'm going to talk about different aspects of zombification. So through the talk, I'm going to talk about microchimerism, fetal microchimerism, when cells from mother's body go into the fetus and vice versa, and what kinds of zombification processes might be at work there. I'm going to talk about some ways that microbes might influence humans in terms of our eating behavior and in terms of stress. And then I'm going to kind of bring it full circle to how we can do research on some of these questions. And this is quite a new sort of framework for actually moving forward in modeling. And modeling, that's one of the methods that I use. So I'm going to show you some of the work I have on that that's not published yet. Okay, so let's start with the Evolutionary Foundations. How many of you know Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene? Okay, most of you. How many of you know this book, The Extended Phenotype? So in the last chapter of The Selfish Gene, Dawkins gives the kind of general argument for the extended phenotype, and then he expands that in this book, The Extended Phenotype. And the idea of the extended phenotype is that the genes that all of us have and that all organisms have, they don't just affect our phenotype, our physiology, our behavior. They also can affect other things in the world. They can make it so that organisms alter their environment. So the example that he uses is the beaver. So I just noticed this today when I was putting this together. That's a little beaver there. So beavers create dams, and those dams help the beavers to accomplish the goals of surviving and reproducing effectively. And so Dawkins argues we can think of these dams that the beavers are making as part of their extended phenotype. So phenotype is not just the organism within the boundaries that we can easily see, but the phenotype includes these effects on the environment. And this is not just limited to effects on the environment like making dams. Dawkins extends this argument to say that organisms, or that the phenotype that a gene is creating can include modifying the behavior of other organisms. So he uses some examples of situations where in mating, individuals manipulate each other's nervous systems. Examples of this across the animal world. And many of you are going to be familiar with examples like the cordyceps fungus, Toxoplasma gondii, hairworm, these organisms that co-opt their hosts. So lots of parasites essentially use their hosts as part of their extended phenotype. So this is really the evolutionary foundation for thinking about zombification, what it is and how it's going to work in evolutionary terms. Now, there's an important, I'm not going to say caveat here because it's really just another layer that we have to add on in order to understand this, which is that all of us, and when I say us, I mean just organisms in general, we have aligned interests with some individuals, right? That if we accomplish our goals, that helps them accomplish their own goals. And with other individuals, we have conflicting interests. And in order to understand how organisms are going to evolve to influence and manipulate other organisms, we have to take into account these two possibilities. So one example on the positive side, or a few examples on the positive side, is that in human relationships, we often have positive fitness interdependence, where our own viability affects the viability of others, or someone else's welfare affects our own ability to accomplish our adaptive goals, surviving, reproducing. So some examples of these are like risk pooling systems that we study in the Human Generosity Project, where individuals will help each other in times of need, and it sort of forms a social insurance kind of system. Mating that results in shared offspring. The mates, they don't have high degree of relatedness, hopefully, but they share relatedness with an offspring, right, that is related to both of them. And so that makes the two parents interdependent in terms of their fitness because the viability of the offspring affects both of their inclusive fitness. And another great example, maybe the most evocative, is wartime, when individuals are literally depending on each other for their day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute survival sometimes. And if the unit does not work as a sort of collective, it puts everyone at risk. So these are all situations where there's a certain amount of shared fate that helps to align these fitness interests. So we have the positive side, but we also have the negative side. Sometimes individuals are pitted against each other in a zero-sum kind of situation. Only one of these suited white guys is going to make it to the top of this mountain. The other one, who fails to plant his flag, is going to be the loser. Probably this guy's going to win it all, this guy's going to lose. When you have situations where there's one winner and one loser, or just one winner and then everyone else doesn't do so well, or actually any situation where status competition is the thing that is being focused on, where there's some rank, one individual is going to get a big piece of the pie, you have negative fitness interdependence. Now, that's not the only situation where you have negative fitness interdependence. You can have it in wartime, where you have one group pitted against another. You could have it in a situation where individuals are trying to extract resources from a common pool. So there's many situations where you can have these conflicting interests. And we can take this idea of positive and negative fitness interdependence and put it into what I call the Ferris wheel framework. So we're kind of, going full on with the carnival kind of theme, zombies and Ferris wheels. And so what we have is a situation here where you can be in the same car here with somebody. And that means if you do well, they do well. Your fitness interests completely aligned. Or you could be opposite ends here, where when one individual goes up, the other one goes down. Right? You could also think of that situation as like a teeter-totter, where one goes up, one goes down. Or you could have partially aligned interests, so maybe not exactly, but in general, if this individual is towards the top, the other one will be, and if they both sort of work together, then they could both, get pretty high up. And then you have here our green figure. So absence of fitness interdependence, right? That's another possibility, that there's no mapping of what happens for one individual to what happens for the other. You could also think of it as, this guy being on a different Ferris wheel. So there's a way here that we can kind of visualize what these different kinds of relationships look like. And what I want to ask you guys while you're looking at this is, which situations of these 4 different situations do you think that there's going to be the highest vulnerability to zombification? And when I use the word zombification, we're going to just say that that's, in general, having one individual influencing the phenotype of the other individual. Anybody want to offer a guess? Yeah.
Probably the absence of fitness interdependence, just because if positive interdependence is positively correlated with fitness, then potentially like a parasite or something like that could increase the fitness of the individual that is not interdependent on another.
So you're thinking about that there'd be an opportunity to potentially establish zombification in that situation. Okay. Yeah.
I would say at 5 and 7.
Okay.
And just like by reading your paper, I would say that we have like this microbiome inside of our gut, and a lot of those microbes like produce chemicals that help our bodies function better, sometimes worse. So it's not entirely positive, but in general it could be.
Okay, so there's sort of an opportunity to bring these 2 figures more into alignment that could benefit both of them. So there isn't a right answer to this question. We don't really know yet, because this is such a new way of approaching things and looking at things. But we do know that, so if you have total alignment of interests, then it's pretty easy to have communication that is honest and reliable happening. If you have pretty high alignment of interest, then you can get communication systems, but they also can evolve to have some manipulation in them that's not in the benefit of both parties, and that can sometimes compromise the viability of those communication systems. In this kind of situation, there might be a huge sort of incentive for each player to manipulate, to influence the other, but they're going to be evolving defenses against each other, right? So not clear what's going to happen in the end evolutionarily, depending on the power of selection at those levels. And then in our case here with the absence of fitness interdependence, if there's no way that individuals are affecting each other, there's not going to be selection for zombifying. But this situation could turn into one where zombifying takes place, like was mentioned. So here we have a framework we can kind of use to think about these different options. Yeah.
Is it implied that the zombification is detrimental for the victim?
What's that?
Is it implied that the zombification is detrimental for the host or the victim?
That's a great question, and I'm going to put that off a little bit, but think about that. Does zombification have to necessarily be a bad thing? So now I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the podcast, and we'll get to that question as we do that. So I started a podcast. It launched in June. It's called Zombified, and Zombified is your source for fresh brains, and it's actually meant to be a bit of a triple entendre. So there's the fresh brains, right? Like in this bowl here, the whole zombie thing, right? Fresh brains, zombies like brains. And then there's the idea of fresh brains in that every week we talk to someone interesting, and that's a fresh brain that you're getting the opportunity to consume. And then the third part is the fresh brains. Like, we try to not take ourselves too seriously on the podcast. It's playful, it's fun, and we encourage people to engage about difficult topics with this sort of fresh lens. So, so there are three ways that Zombified can be your source for fresh brains. You can choose whichever one suits you. And we are really, really lucky to be working with an amazing illustrator. His name is Neil Smith, and he's done amazing artwork for our episodes. This was our launch episode where me and my co-host Dave Lundberg-Kenrick are in the midst of the zombie apocalypse and trying to get to that brain in the lab. Now, Luis, let me take your question about if zombification always has to be a bad thing. So our pilot episode was with Clive Wynne, who just happens to have a book that's coming out right now called Dog is Love. If you were watching Good Morning America yesterday, you would have seen him on it. And he talks about how our whole sort of psychology and emotional attitude towards dogs is really based in human sociality, and that dogs, in a way, are able to hijack our parental investment systems so that we invest in them. And we talk for an hour or so about these different kinds of ways that dogs influence us to take care of them. But it turns out there's a lot of benefits that we also get from interacting with dogs. Everything from, in some small-scale societies, humans use dogs to help them hunt. In our modern-day society, having a pet, having a dog, it actually improves health outcomes for people. So it's not clear that it's just a one-way relationship where dogs are zombifying us. In fact, given how extensively we have bred dogs to do the kinds of things that we like them to do, not just in terms of being able to hunt and do work, but also in terms of providing emotional benefits for us, like being behaviorally very warm and loyal and making eye contact. And Clive points out that dogs actually have an oxytocin system very similar to humans, and therefore, yes, your dog really does love you, is his conclusion. So, so I really like that we started the podcast with that episode, because I think it's important when we're talking about zombification not to necessarily see it as a negative thing. It can be a very positive thing. In fact, when we fall in love, a lot of what's going on is our systems are being hijacked. And a lot of the time, falling in love is a good thing. Not always, but a lot of the time. So here's some of the other episodes we have. This is one of my favorites, Monster Algorithms with Ed Finn. Ed talks about how the algorithms inside our smartphones and in general on social media and other platforms are actually evolving to manipulate us. So if you like tech and creepiness, definitely check that episode out. I have an episode about diet with Corey Wiesner. I have a few episodes about stress. I know stress zombifies me. I don't know if it zombifies you guys, but something that we deal with. Some of you might know Joe Alcock. This is him being zombified by the microbiome. And we have an episode where we talk about microbial zombification. I'm going to mention a few things about it in my talk, but if you want sort of more in-depth discussion of it, definitely go to that podcast. And another one of my favorites is Curiosity Kills with Barbara Naderson Horowitz. She has a book that is, I think, also about to hit the bookstores called Wildhood, which is an excellent book about the evolutionary biology of adolescence across species. And she makes a really, really interesting point about how adolescents actually have this sort of morbid curiosity that can serve them in some ways. So spoiler alert, in the end we decide that teenagers are going to save us in the zombie apocalypse. And our final episode, which if you just go on the Zombified feed, which you can get on iTunes, Spotify, all the platforms, this is the episode that will come up first for you, which is Duct Tape Before Guns with Emily Zarka. And this is an episode that focuses on how we actually engage about challenging issues, including apocalyptic situations, but also how we think about ourselves in relation to zombies, both fictional and factual. So it's a really fun episode, and you'll learn what you should have in your Go pack as well. We're about to put out a few mini episodes for to tide people over until the next season. We're calling these episodes Brain Snacks, and I have to warn you, they may contain vegans, so you have to be cautious if you don't agree that you should eat vegan. So these are going to be streaming soon, probably a week or two. We're going to be putting them out. Okay. That's it on the podcast. Let's use this, though, as a way of thinking about the domains of zombification, right? So we had a lot of different topics that we're covering in the podcast. And one of them, I think the clearest, the easiest one to think about, given the foundations in evolutionary biology with the extended phenotype, et cetera, is the example of cross-species zombification, where you have parasites that are manipulating their hosts. Right? It's not that hard to think about a parasite and its host starting to hijack the host in ways that benefit the parasite. And there are many examples of these in the evolutionary biology literature. Now, one that's not so far from parasites hijacking hosts is starting to think about the microbiome and how the microbiome might be under selective pressure to alter host behavior. So that's an area of particular interest to me. I'm going to show you some of my work on that. Genetic relatives. So how many of you feel like your interests are completely aligned with your genetic relatives? Raise your hand. Nobody. All right. Yes. So despite the fact that we have a lot of genes in common with our relatives, we do not have completely aligned interests with them. There are kin that we share 50% of our genes with. There are kin that we share 25%, less and less. And then there are those non-genetic kin, i.e. in-laws, et cetera, which you have some aligned interests with because of potentially having shared descendants, but again, not entirely shared interests. Certainly doesn't manifest behaviorally as such. So thinking about what is going on in terms of relationships among genetic relatives and extended kin. This is a really important domain of zombification. And thinking then more broadly, mates, social interaction partners, how do we zombify each other? What are the processes that underlie that? And what are the evolutionary forces that have governed the way that both parties evolved to interact with each other? And then this is one of my favorites. I'm hoping that I will go quickly enough through the presentation that I can talk to you a little bit about this at the end. We have set loose upon the world a whole other type of replicator that lives in our brains and in these silicon devices and our phones. And those entities are also evolving to increase their viability using our brains and our computers. So a whole other world opens up when we recognize that we have another replicating system that is a parasite on our brains. All right, microchimerism. How many of you know what microchimerism is? Okay, the rest of you, your minds are about to be blown. All right, so here's your mom. Here's you. When you were in your mom's womb, cells from you were going into your mom's body, and cells from your mom were going into your body via the umbilical cord. Now, what are those cells doing? Where are they? What's going on? We don't know. How many of you have a younger sibling? Your cells that went into your mom might have gone into your younger sibling. So we don't know the extent yet of how many individuals these cells can jump from, how many generations this can go through, but there is evidence at least that a second offspring can have cells from a first offspring. If your mom had a miscarriage before you were born, you might have cells from that child that never existed in your body. All right, how many of your minds are blown? Oh, pretty good. You guys are not so hard of a crowd, which is awesome for me. Okay. All right, so what are they doing? What are they doing? These orange dots represent the cells, the fetal cells, inside the mom's tissues. And this is a figure that we made to summarize predictions from this approach. And essentially, what we argue is that these cells from the baby that are in the mom should be exerting changes on the mom's physiology to upregulate milk production, to increase heat production, because the baby relies on the mother largely for thermoregulation, to change the mother's immune system to tolerate those fetal cells, and most controversially and most in the framework of brain zombification, cells from fetal cells have been found in maternal brains, and they're expressing genes. So it's quite possible that those cells are actually doing something that might be in the fetus's interests. The moment that last part is speculation, but from an extended phenotype kind of perspective, a selfish gene kind of perspective, we would expect if such cells existed that could, say, induce the mother to increase her level of investment in that offspring, that those genes would become larger in frequency in the population in future generations because they were providing benefits to the copies of those genes. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to go to the bioessays paper that I wrote with Amy Boddy and Melissa Wilson-Sayers and Angela Fortunato, where we review a lot of the literature that is relevant to these hypotheses. So there's very conflicting effects of fetal cells on maternal health. Some studies show presence of fetal cells is associated with better outcomes, lower cancer risk, better immune outcomes, and there's other papers that show the opposite. And what we propose is that this kind of framework might actually help us to make sense of why that literature is so conflictual. And a very large interest of mine is in the behavioral manipulation. There are many changes that often happen psychologically and behaviorally for women after birth that are not well understood. Postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis. There are so many huge question marks about what is going on postpartum, and we know that the immune system is playing a role. We know that there's a lot of clearance of fetal cells, and so I think there's an opportunity to see if these phenomena are related to each other, if microchimerism might have some role to play in that. Okay. Microbiome and behavior. So just a quick overview of the microbiome. Microbes are able to interface with our physiology. They interface with our nervous system. They can produce neurotransmitters. They can change signaling on our vagus nerve. And they can directly communicate with the brain. There are also microbes in the brain. It's not really understood how the microbes in the brain are interacting with the brain, but the brain is not sterile as was long assumed. And microbes, they have their own life, both within species and between species. So microbes can compete with each other, cooperate with each other. And there's many different kinds of microbes. You have bacteria, you have yeast, you have viruses, you have macroparasites. And the microbiome is not just like one thing, right? It's this complex ecosystem of organisms. And on top of that, microbes can cooperate and compete with us, with their hosts. So it's a complex ecological system for sure. And there's been a sort of resurgence of interest in this over the last few years. Some of you might be familiar with this idea of the holobiont, right? That we should be considering our microbes as part of ourselves and their genes as part of ourselves, which you can sort of understand the impetus behind that, right? And that's sort of right. They are kind of part of us, but they're also their own entities with their own genetic interests. And sometimes those interests can be aligned with us, right, with their hosts. And other times they're not. And some really interesting things might happen here in this space where they're not aligned. But also interesting things can happen when they are aligned. And so we can then just ask this broader question of how do hosts and microbes influence each other's fitness? And what are the opportunities for them to positively and negatively influence each other's fitness? So here's a little summary of a literature review that I've been doing in collaboration with graduate student Jessica in the back there. Hi, Jessica. So what we looked at is in terms of social behavior and these domains sort of that we think of as part of psychology, evolutionary psychology, what are the ways that microbes can affect the fitness of the hosts? And then what are the ways that hosts can influence the fitness of their microbes? So let's take risk-taking first. So there's some evidence that Toxoplasma gondii can increase risk-taking behavior in humans. And if we think of it from the perspective of how the host can influence the microbe's fitness, if hosts are engaging in more risky behavior, they might actually be increasing their exposure to microbes and their opportunities to transmit microbes. Social affiliation. We know that low microbial diversity contributes to social deficits and social anxiety, and that microbes can alter oxytocin production and oxytocin function and the receptors. So social affiliation, microbes, they have some mechanisms to affect hosts. How about hosts affecting microbes? Well, cohabitation, living with somebody, gives these opportunities for social contact that can transmit microbes. And in fact, if you have a dog, not only are you sharing microbes with your dog, but the presence of that dog in your house makes it so that you have more similar microbes to the other members of your household. So I'll let you think about how that's happening. Okay. All right, status and dominance. So it's possible for microbes to actually take glucocorticoids and convert them to androgens, like testosterone. That might provide a mechanism for microbes to actually affect individuals' interest and willingness to engage in status competition. And we know that high status provides more opportunities for transmitting microbes. So maybe there's some room there for microbes to influence their viability via their hosts. Mating. Microbial diversity increases attractiveness, and in some animal models, the microbes are actually altering the mate preferences of the animals. So there is some room there for microbes to have effects on host mating behavior. And then, of course, your mate choice is going to influence the microbes that get transmitted to you and the microbes that you transmit. All right, finally, kin recognition. So this is important from the host's perspective if we think that inclusive fitness, so individuals actually providing benefits for individuals that they're related to is an important thing for host fitness. Well, if you actually look at what compounds play a role in olfactory kin recognition, many of them are produced by microbes. And then if we think of the sort of how our host's going to affect microbes, if there are differential interactions with kin, if you're interacting more with kin than with others, for example, that provides more opportunities for the microbes to transmit to kin who might have a more similar immune profile than a random other individual, possibly. So there are lots of opportunities here for hosts to influence the viability of microbes and for microbes to influence the viability of hosts. So let's look at a few examples in more depth. So one of the things that I've been really fascinated by for a long time is whether microbes might be playing a role in eating behavior. And I'm just going to put up the visual abstract for this paper because this basically sums up the paper very well. So the idea is that you have selection pressure on microbes to manipulate their hosts to consume the foods that preferentially feed those microbes. And here we have our puppet. That's so we're trying to be creative with this this figure here and make it so it sort of looks like that's a puppet, like a marionette kind of puppet. I don't know if it really worked, but that was our idea. So we've got a host that is being potentially controlled by microbes through these various mechanisms, which might contribute to unhealthy eating. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here to our puppet. So this, again, I encourage you, if you're interested in this, go to the bioessays paper because we have the literature review there in a way that it's much easier for you to look up the papers because here it just has the numbers that correspond to the papers. But the idea is that microbes can change opioid receptors, they can change taste receptors, they can produce toxins, and actually the production of toxins, we know that increases eating behavior. The vagus nerve is an important superhighway from the gut to the brain. And interruption of the vagus nerve actually can lead to weight loss. So that suggests that the vagus nerve is playing an important role in eating behavior. We know that microbes can signal along it. And in addition to this sort of negative puppet mastering with toxins, microbes also have a line into the reward system in terms of producing dopamine and serotonin, and they also have genes that code for human neurotransmitters and analogs of human neurotransmitters. So they have a lot of machinery that they could be using to manipulate us. Now, the extent to which these things evolved in microbes in order to manipulate us, we don't know the answer to that question. We just know that they have a whole bunch of smoking guns that they might have used to try to manipulate us. All right, microbiome and stress. I know you guys are still probably processing all of that, all those ways that microbes might be affecting our eating behavior, but I'm going to throw another picture at you. This one looks less like a puppet and more like a zombie. So I'm going to tell you a little story, though. I put this up at the lab retreat that we had with my lab and Carlo's Maley lab. We have a lab retreat together, and one of Carlo Maley's students, when I put this up, she said, "Is that supposed to be Carlo?" And I promise you, it is completely unintentional if it does look like him, which it kind of does, which is creepy. So the idea here is that a stressed host is actually a really great environment for certain kinds of microbes. So microbes that need access to quick sugar in the bloodstream, microbes that can grow rapidly in the presence of that sugar, and microbes that in general benefit from a host having a very disrupted environment where the homeostasis is not really working properly. So for those of you familiar with life history theory, those sound like fast life history microbes, right? They're microbes that are sort of benefiting from these opportunities for quick growth. So just to kind of take you through this briefly, we know that stress increases glucose production. And when microbes are in an environment that have high glucose, you get the preferential expansion of pathogenic microbes. We know that stress increases the permeability of the gut, and that allows microbes to invade into the body cavity more, where they can take more advantage of host resources. And stress, in particular chronic stress, can suppress the immune system, allowing more opportunities for microbes to proliferate and survive. Now, not all microbes are going to benefit from host stress, right? Some microbes potentially do a lot better in a host environment that is better regulated. So in this paper, which it's currently under review also at bioessays, you might see a theme that all of these papers are in bioessays. It's because they like ideas that are somewhat speculative, which many of these still are, but grounded in the literature in terms of the review going into it. So all of this, all of the pieces of this puzzle are grounded in research that we know to be true. The picture that I've put together, that's the speculative part. We don't know if all these pieces fit together in this way that I'm describing. All right, are you guys ready for another zombie picture? All right. So once we have a situation where hosts can be potentially hijacked by stress microbes, so now I'm going to ask you guys to sort of imagine with me, to speculate with me about, well, what would the effects of this be? So imagine up here we have Z, who is hijacked by stress microbes, and X over there, the target, who is not hijacked by stress microbes, just hanging out. Now, if Z is able to stress X, then X all of a sudden becomes a better environment for those stress microbes. And then perhaps there's an opportunity for the transmission of those stress microbes. And now we have another individual who is zombified by stress microbes. Thankfully, there's also a nice hippie boho image over here too, which I'll take you guys through, which is that there's probably another class of microbes that are what we're calling resilience microbes, just for the sake of kind of being able to communicate about it effectively. And those microbes benefit actually from the host being more resilient to stress, not being so disrupted when there are inputs coming in that might otherwise stress the individual, and the environment is sort of more stable. And it's quite possible that these resilience microbes might create a situation in, sort of hijack their host to make them super friendly and wanting to cuddle, and then you have a target here who is more receptive to those resilience microbes or love bugs or whatever you want to call them. And now we have two people who want to inappropriately hug everybody around them. So this is a speculation that's coming from putting a lot of these pieces of the puzzle together to make this zombification picture. All right. So in the vein of that last set of zombies that I just showed you, we can ask the question about how microbes evolve to be beneficial or harmful to hosts. And in particular, can microbes evolve to be beneficial to hosts? Because a lot of the work that has been done on the microbiome, or on, I should say, on understanding infection, like what are known as the SIR models, the susceptible, infected, resistant kind of models, those assume negative effects that microbes have on hosts. But this whole holobiont idea, and the microbiome being such a great thing and another organ, that's all assuming that microbes are having a positive effect. So let's try to bring all of these together into one modeling framework. And so we know that microbes can provide a lot of benefits to hosts that include defending against harmful microbes because they're sort of taking up that ecological space and sometimes actually sort of fortifying like the gut barrier and such. They can break down nutrients for the host so that the host can access them. They can help regulate the immune system, and they can also potentially alter host behavior. Actually, I'm going to take away the potentially. We know that microbes can alter host behavior. The extent to which they've been selected specifically to do that is a question. All right, so I'm going to show you a little bit of this model that I'm working on. The background is essentially that this is a neglected topic in the modeling of microbial host evolution. And not only has there been very little work done looking at the evolution of beneficial microbes, the host behavior is usually not a part of the picture. And what I looked at in the model that I'm currently collecting data on is what happens when hosts are able to avoid interacting with individuals who they perceive to have microbes that are harmful. And there may be adaptations that human hosts have, or we know there are adaptations that human hosts have to avoid interacting with individuals who are infected with harmful microbes. So then that kind of brings up the question of, well, how is this going to potentially affect microbial evolution? So, big picture, how does host behavior influence the evolution of microbial cooperation? And I'm going to jump ahead here. In particular, the question is whether conditional movement can alter the evolution of microbes in terms of whether they're beneficial or harmful to the host. So I have a model here. Actually, I'm going to take a moment to show it to you guys instead of going through it this way. So here we have white. Oh, that didn't work. Do I have a person who can make this work real quick? Or is this yeah, okay. I'm sorry, guys. It's not working. So I'm just going to continue. If you want to see it after, come on up. But I have individuals who are moving around, hosts that are moving around, and they're microbes that can then go on to those hosts and then get transmitted to other hosts as those microbes are intersecting with each other. And so this is a model where I'm looking at the evolution of microbes sort of within a generation of hosts. So the hosts are not evolving, only the microbes are. So question here is basically if it's costly for the microbes to provide benefits for the host, can they still evolve to be beneficial to the host? Right? So if it costs something for the microbes to do something good for their host, can this still evolve? Basically, I instantiated this cost as the difference in growth rate between being beneficial and being harmful. So microbes could grow faster if they were harmful and less fast if they were beneficial. So that's how it's costly for them. Just to summarize a few things, when the microbes have the same growth rate inside the host, the microbes that are beneficial win, sort of not unexpected. Then what we can do is vary the relative cost of being beneficial. So here are some results from the preliminary data. So this is how much costlier it is to be cooperative than it is to take a cost to impose a cost on the host. And what we see is that as the cost of being beneficial increases, that microbes are actually, as the cost of being beneficial increases, microbes can still evolve to be beneficial to their host. And if we add the conditional movement, so if we add in hosts that can leave uncooperative others, what we see is that it's possible for the microbes to evolve to be beneficial even when the relative cost of being beneficial is relatively low. So I'm going to jump ahead now because I want to kind of finish up here by telling you guys about algorithms and stuff. But the main point of all of this is to start to use this framework of modeling to get at some of these issues of how hosts and microbes are going to evolve to affect each other, and eventually make sense to add this coevolution bit. And ultimately, the goal would be to see if we can improve human health by increasing the opportunities for the positive effects and lowering the opportunities for the negative ones. All right, last few minutes, algorithms. How many of you have been in this kind of situation? Ever? Okay, for those of you who've been in this situation, did you want to have a conversation, but you were sort of locked into this? Or did you actually want to scroll? So if you wanted to have a conversation, but you were kind of locked into this, raise your hand. All right, some. And how many of you were just, yeah, actually you wanted to be on your phone? Okay, that's fine, and that's cool, because sometimes there's really great stuff on your phone. I get it. But this is a situation that we are encountering more and more, right? That we have this feed that is constantly providing things for us that are engaging us and sometimes keeping us from having conversations. Now, I saw this picture in a talk that a colleague of mine gave, and I realized that this is a pretty much exact mapping of something called the stag hunt game in game theory. Here's the stag hunt. You have a chance to team up with your buddy and go hunt for large game. That requires coordination, but it can potentially lead to a huge payoff. You both come home with stag. Your other option is to go hunting rabbits. You don't need anybody else to do that, and it's a pretty safe option. If nobody else shows up, it doesn't make a difference in terms of how many rabbits you can get. You can get just as many rabbits per person by yourself or in a group. So we have stag, everyone's real happy. Rabbits, people are reasonably happy. Now, the dilemma comes in that if your interaction partner was planning on going hunting stag and you didn't show up and you went and hunted rabbits, you've got something and your partner's got nothing, and vice versa. So this is a situation where the socially optimal thing is actually to both go hunt stag. But if either of you are worried that the other person isn't going to show up to hunt stag, then you're safer hunting or scrolling for rabbits. Here they are. They're scrolling for their rabbits. Just scroll, 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 feeding on those rabbits versus having a conversation. Now, this isn't always going to be the payoff matrix, right? Sometimes, yes, sometimes this is what both people actually really want to do, as we demonstrated a few minutes ago in this room. But very often, individuals are stuck in that situation because they don't want to be in a situation where their partner is on their phone while they are just waiting to have a conversation. So this is a social dilemma that we face probably on a daily basis when we are interacting with people in the world. And so what can we learn from taking this sort of game theoretic perspective? Well, we know that the way to solve a stag hunt game is to communicate and to coordinate so that you both choose the option of hunting stag at the same time. You both move from hunting rabbits to hunting stag together. And that solves it. So there are some things that we can do in our lives, like for example, you could check in about setting a time limit and then stopping at the same time. That's kind of hard though, right? So what are some other possibilities? Well, we're actually looking into developing a new smartphone app that we would also be able to use to collect data on this. Which would give people an opportunity to opt in voluntarily to real dialogue with the person sitting in front of them. So the idea would be that the app has location services that allow you to have a list of here are the people who I want to have a conversation with if I am within a few feet of them. And then it would show up an option for in 2 minutes having a blackout on your phone. And only if both people clicked yes would your phones then black out in 2 minutes. And then you would have the opportunity to have a conversation. And the idea is it would black out in 2 minutes, for 2 minutes, and then, if you decide at the end of 2 minutes you want to go back to scrolling, of course you could do that, but at least it's a chance to have that conversation. So that's a way of getting from this option to this option. So then that's the social media dilemma and Stag hunt together if you wanted to take a look at that again. Okay, so in the future, in 2020, we're having another zombie apocalypse medicine meeting. And even zombies are into dating using technology, as you can see. And so this meeting is going to be at ASU here next October, so a little over a year. And the focus of the meeting is on the role of technology in zombifying us and the role of sex. And sex actually here is applying both to like mating, but also ideas about what sex is, about gender, about sexual identity. So we're dealing with all of those issues in the context of this conference, and of course also the intersection between sex and technology. And I wish I could tell you what we will have at the intersection between sex and technology, but between now and October of next year, I think a lot of things are going to be happening in that space, so we don't necessarily know exactly what the future will hold. But the future will hold more zombification. So in my last few minutes, I want to just ask you guys if you have been zombified. So have any of these things potentially affected you? Do you maybe have toxoplasma in your brain that is affecting your neuroticism, or a relationship that is affecting your behavior? Has culture influenced you to do anything? Yeah, probably. Diet, your dog, social media, stress, your fear of monsters. I mean, when you were a kid, at least, maybe. And then, of course, considering the future, what kind of apocalypses are we heading towards? And I use this word, the apocalypse, in a purposefully lighthearted way to just refer to the kinds of challenges that we will be facing in the future that we might not be prepared for, that we might not be managing our risk properly for. And I think that having a more imaginative kind of approach to thinking about the forces that are affecting our behavior, especially when it comes to technology and how the world is changing, that process of being more imaginative and engaging with the science and with humanities together can be a great way for us to move forward and really leverage all of our brains to hopefully create a more zombie-free future and reduce the global burden of zombification. So thank you all. Thank you to my lab, and thank you to all of my colleagues. And that's Zombified, your source for fresh brains if you want to look it up.
All right, thanks very much,
Thank you,
Athena, for lots of food for thought.
Brain for thought.
Yes.
Or brain for food.
We're very close to finishing time, so I'll take one question, and then there's tea time next door. So everybody's welcome to join us for tea time. So who has a very burning question? Yes.
Will you be collecting any data from your app to use in your research?
Yeah, that's the goal, is to develop the app and to use it as a way of actually understanding to what extent individuals are having improvement in their relationship from the app versus not using it. But it's still early in that process. We're working with a group in the UK on developing the app. It actually turns out it's really hard to have access to location services. So especially on iPhones, they don't allow apps to have access to the kinds of information that we'd need. So we're dealing with some technical issues there. But we're hoping that maybe in the medium term, we'll get a little bit more traction with some of the tech companies maybe to work with us, because I think people are starting to feel like there's a need to have some boundaries around how much feeds are influencing our social relationships. So,
Very quick.
yeah.
Quick question, quick answer.
Cambridge Analytica. Is that an example of zombification?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of sort of runaway processes that have been happening in the technology space, and especially when it comes to how sort of humans are, our psychology, our evolved psychology can easily get hijacked by certain kinds of information, right, that feeds into our concerns about, protecting our groups, about things that are threats to us. Fear is a very powerful motivator, not just for action, but also for sharing information. And I think that it is going to take a little bit of time for us to kind of catch up with all of the things that algorithms have learned about human nature. And that, even without these algorithms being specifically sort of designed to manipulate us, they evolve to do that because they're being replicated based on their effectiveness at accomplishing that goal.
Yes, so they're technically.
Yeah, so it's a zombification process, yeah.
All right, let's thank Athena again.